Namaskara and welcome to our next session on the yogic life. So before we start reading the, the handout, the Karapatram, let us, I want to take a few minutes to talk about something. So Paramapurusha is the ship of this Bhavasagara. He is the ship of this Bhavasagara. Tadekam smarama, tadekam japamaha, tadekam jagat sakshibhutam namamaha, tadekam nidanam niralamba isham, dhavam bodhipotam sharanam vrajamaha. So I'll just say that one more time. Tadekam smaramaha, tadekam japamaha, tadekam jagat sakshibhutam namamaha, tadekam nidanam niralamba isham, dhavam bodhipotam sharanam vrajamaha. So we know that mind is the vishayakam. It always has a vishaya. It can never be without an object, right? So mind, it's kind of impossible to have the mind without a vishaya. It's always with a vishaya. So since the mind always has a vishaya, so then what should be the vishaya of the mind is under our control, right? Having the mind without a vishaya is not under our control, but having the mind with a vishaya, and what vishaya the mind has is under our control. So what should be the vishaya of our mind? The vishaya of our mind should be that cosmic entity. That cosmic entity should be the vishaya, the object of our ideation, right? So the mind, we have to be single pointed. So if the mind is running in 1,000 different directions, then we cannot progress further. You have to make your mind single pointed. Only when the mind is single pointed on Paramapurusha, then only it can merge into that supreme entity. So what this sloka said was Tadekam smaramaha. So we should remember that entity, that Paramapurusha, that Ekam. So the mind should have one vishaya, and what that vishaya is, that Ekaha Vishayaha, one vishaya is Paramapurusha. Let us remember that vishaya, not anything. Let us not remember all these Laukika Vishayas. Let us not remember what is outside. Let us not remember, what should I buy, how much money I earn, how much wealth I have, or how much more fame I want to collect. None of those. What should be the only vishaya of the mind? The vishaya of the mind should be that supreme entity, should be that Paramapurusha. Tadekam smaramaha, tadekam japamaha. So what should we meditate? What should be the japa? What is the mantra that we should say? What is the mantra that we should keep repeating? What is a japa? Japa means constant repetition, right? Constantly repeating a particular word, right? That is japa. And what should be the japa? The japa should be his name. Let us do the japa of his name and no other words, right? There are actually 3 types of japa: manasika japa, upamsu japa, and vachanika japa. So manasika japa is you mentally repeat the mantra. Nobody knows that you're repeating the mantra. Inside your mind you're repeating the mantra, and nobody knows that you're repeating the mantra. And only it is within your mind, and only that entity knows it. If you're repeating Paramapurusha's name, and only Paramapurusha knows it, nobody else knows it. That is what is manasika japa. Upamsu japa is that you use your lips, only you hear it, nobody else hear it, but you're actually whispering. You're whispering the name of Paramapurusha. That is upamsu. You're actually using your lips. And the third one is vachanika japa. Vachanika japa is you're loudly saying, repeating the name of Paramapurusha. So these 3 types of japa, what is the best japa? The best japa is manasika japa. Vachanika japa is the worst one, and manasika japa, mentally repeating Paramapurusha's name, that is what is manasika japa, and that is the best way of reaching Paramapurusha, right? So we said tadekam smaramaha, tadekam japamaha. Let us only do the japa of that Paramapurusha. And tadekam jagat sakshibhutam namamaha. So when I do salutation, I will do salutation only to that sakshibhutam Paramapurusha. tadekam jagat sakshibhutam namamaha. Namamaha means to accept the supremacy of Paramapurusha. Namamaha. Namamaha means when do we do namamaha? It's like, even in the world you do salam to somebody. When do you do salam to somebody? When somebody has a supremacy over you, then you do the salam, right? So this supremacy, this acceptance of supremacy is called as namaha kriya, right? So namamaha means I'm going to surrender, right? You have to surrender to that Paramapurusha. You have to recognize that supremacy of whom? Not any Tom, Dick and Harry, but it is the supremacy of that supreme entity, of that that Paramapurusha who is shining like a bright light, right? So he is the Jagat Sakshi Bhutam. He is the witnessing entity of this whole universe. No matter who is awake or who is asleep, Paramapurusha is always watching you. There is no corner. You cannot go and hide in any corner. He is watching in all the directions. He is present everywhere. So that is why we keep saying that Paramapurusha is always with you. There is no need to feel that you're alone, right? Why? Because he is present everywhere. So it is impossible for you to be alone. He is always there with you, because there is no place he is not there. So he is witnessing everything that you're doing. And what should you do? What should you do to get him? Is to surrender, is to do the namamaha. We should do the namaha to only Paramapurusha, right? We should do the namaha to only Paramapurusha, not to any Tom, Dick and Harry, right? And then that witnessing entity is a sakshi satta, is witnessing entity of this entire paridrishyamanam jagat. This universe is actually called jagat in Sanskrita, because jagat means something moving, right? In this universe, nothing is stationary, nothing is fixed, everything keeps moving. That is why this universe is called as a jagat. Actually the root, the verb is gam dhatuhu, and from the gam dhatuhu you get the word jagat, right? So what is the property of the jagat? Is movement. Without movement, because gam dhatu means movement, gatihi. So what is the characteristic of this jagat? Is it keeps moving. There's nothing stationary, right? So tadekam nidanam niralamba isham, right? So everything is happening within him. Tadekam nidanam niralamba isham. So everything in this universe has some shelter or the other, right? Like for instance, if a child is dependent on its parents, right? The parents may be dependent on somebody else, and then that somebody else may be dependent on somebody else. So like this, we see that all of us are dependent on something. For like, if we look, like if you take a particular town, the town is dependent on it takes shelter in the district, and then that district takes shelter in the state, then that state takes shelter in the country, that country takes the shelter in the continent. So like this, that continent takes shelter in the planet, that planet takes shelter within the solar system, and then solar system is within Paramapurusha. So everything in this universe is dependent ultimately on Paramapurusha, but Paramapurusha is the only thing which has no shelter. He is shelterless. He doesn't need any shelter. He is not dependent on any shelter. His nidanam, his stay is that it is niralambam. It's not alambanam. He's not having the dependency on anybody. He's shelterless. He's there all the time, and he's supporting everybody, right? No matter I have somebody else to support me or not, but he is always there. That is why he is called as niralamba isham, means alambanam nasti. He doesn't have any other, he doesn't need any support. His existence does not depend on the compassion of another entity, right? He doesn't need the compassion of another entity, and he is niralamba isham. Bhavam bodhipotam sharanam vrajamaha. So what is the way to cross this what is the way to cross this bhavasagara? What is the way to cross this samsara sagara? Right? As I was saying, everything in this world, every object in this world is dependent on something. Its existence is dependent on something else, right? So for instance, if you look at a pot, the pot's existence is dependent on the clay. The clay's existence is dependent on its all the different avayavas. That is dependent on finally the Paramapurusha. Right? So every entity is ultimately dependent on Paramapurusha. So Bhavasamudra or Bhavasagara. I said Bhavam Bodhipotam Sharanam Vrajamaha. Bhavasamudraha Bhavasagaraha. So this sagara, this we take birth according to our karma pala. We take birth again and again and again. We might take birth from plants to animals to human forms. Depending on our samskaras, we may take a birth, right? That individual entities, samskaras, karma palas, is called as bhava, right? So each of us have so many bhavas, which have so many karma palas. So crossing that bhava, crossing it, so it's like a sagara. So this karma pala, which makes us to take birth again and again and again, that is like a bhava. That is like a big bhava. It's like an ocean, right? So this bhava sagara means the sagara of these samskaras, sagara of these karma palas. How do I cross this bhava? How do I cross this bhava? This bhava seems insurmountable. It's almost impossible for me to cross it, right? It feels like there is no way I can cross it. I feel helpless. But the thing is that nobody should feel helpless. Nobody should feel helpless, because if you surrender to that Paramapurusha, that supreme entity, then this bhava is nothing. Bhava is nothing. He is the pati of this bhava. He is the lord of this bhava. So if you take sarana, if you take the sharanagati of Paramapurusha, then you can cross this bhava sagara, this samsara sagara. So this swimming this bhava sagara becomes, this ocean of bhava becomes easy, because he is there always holding your hand. There is no chance of drowning. There is no chance of feeling helpless, because he is already there, right? And so if you think that you have the strength in your hands and legs to cross this samsara sagara, then you're actually mistaken. If this samsara sagara is so difficult to cross, if you're thinking that you have the strength in your hands and legs to cross this, then you will never cross it. But if you get a good boat, if you get a good support, right, then you can cross this ocean. So if you think that I don't have the strength, but the strength is in Paramapurusha, the strength is in you. You are the support. You are that boat. Please take me across. If you put that burden on that Paramapurusha and take shelter in him, then what happens? You can easily cross this samsara sagara and easily go to the other bank, right? It is by the mercy of Paramapurusha that we will be able to do this. So we have to take saranam vrajamaha. We have to take the support of that cosmic entity as a nauka, as a boat, for us to cross this samsara sagara. Otherwise it's impossible. If we have our vanity saying, oh, I'm everything, I'm the lord of this world, then it's impossible to cross this. If you are ahankara, with your ahankara, right, if one has ego, we can never cross this samsara sagara. So one has to give up that ego. One has to think that Paramapurusha is the only support that I have, nothing else. The only sole support that I have is Paramapurusha. Take complete shelter in him. Then what happens? You can easily cross this samsara sagara. It is not impossible to cross this samsara sagara, and then that will become the lakshya of life, is to cross the samsara sagara by taking nidana, by taking shelter in that nidalamba isham, that shelterless Paramapurusha. I take shelter, and by that I can cross this samsara sagara. So that is what I wanted to talk today, right? So essentially what I meant was that mind always has an object. We have to make the main object of our mind is to ideate on Paramapurusha. Always meditate on that, meditate his name, right? Repeat his name, and then do namaha. Accept the supremacy of Paramapurusha. Accept to surrender to Paramapurusha. When you do all of that, take his shelter, then you can cross this samsara sagara easily. Then even Maya, right? Maya, who is supposed to be very powerful, she will not be able to do anything, right? So Daivihi Esha Gunamayi Mama Maya Duratyaya. So this Maya is the divine Maya, is very, very difficult to cross. Daivihi Esha Mama Maya. This Maya is Mama Maya, is Paramapurusha's Maya. It's very, very difficult to cross. दैवीः एषा गुणमयी मम माया मामेव ये प्रपद्यन्ते मायामेतां तरन्ति ते. So one who takes complete surrender to Paramapurusha, one who completely does the Saranagati to Paramapurusha, they can cross this Maya, because Maya is under the control of Paramapurusha. So to cross this Maya, you need the shelter of Paramapurusha. That is what the Gita Sloka also talks about. So now we can actually go to our Karapatram. So we were talking about what is this world, right? So far, we talked about the Shristi chakra. Okay, so far we have been talking about the Shristi chakra. We said that that at 6 o'clock, all the bhutas, panchabhutas, from 3 o'clock to 6 o'clock, when tamoguna is dominant, then all the bhutas get created. By 6 o'clock, all the bhutas are created, and at 6 o'clock we have if the anukula vatavaranam is there and kendranuga shakti becomes predominant, then life emerges. But on the other hand, if the anukula vatavaranam is not there, and if the kendra tiga shakti becomes predominant, then we can have a jadasputa, and it can go back to the original bhutas. So that is what we were talking about. So now we can actually go further. Let me actually share my screen. Okay. So the creation gradually evolved.
Creation gradually evolved from subtle to crude. Subtle chitta gradually became the crudest chit tattva. Similarly, it will have to slowly return to subtlety again. Solid ghee, butter extract, cannot be melted all at once. In the same way, chitta in the form of solid earth will gradually become subtle. That chitta gradually advances from crude to subtle is demonstrated by the evolution of plant and animal life on earth. The first plant life on this earth appeared as the class of plants called kai, a form of early algae and mosses. Kai cannot be said to be an inanimate because it does show some reflection of consciousness, whatever that reflection may be. So in this paragraph, it just starts to narrate how the gradual manifestation or transformation of from crude sthiti tattva to subtle paramatatva takes place. So first it becomes the first form of life, the plant life, is what's called kai, which is a form of algae and mosses, and this apparently does have a reflection of consciousness, and they just sort of points at whatever that reflection may be implying. We have certain hesitation in seeing that consciousness in something that's inanimate, and in some sense algae and mosses are also inanimate, except it does grow, so that growth is looked at as a form of reflection of consciousness. But it's that transformation from the tattva towards plant and animal life, and then towards human life, and like you said, eventually could transform into into the cosmic entity, the Paramapurusha.
Okay. Nicely said, Mahodaya. So yeah, that is the idea over here. So when we arrive at 6 o'clock, so from 12 o'clock to 6 o'clock is the movement from the subtle to the crude. When we arrive at 6 o'clock, which we are calling as the Kshiti Tattva or the Prithvi Tattva, that's the earth. Like we actually talked in the last week in depth about how it begins to move from 6 o'clock to 7 o'clock. So this is that is actually a critical time in the Kshiti Tattva as part of the Shristi chakra when life emerges out of stone, right? By which we can understand that stone is not crude, right? It appears crude, but it is densely qualified by Prakriti, right? But its essence is not crude. So what we see here is the movement from subtle to crude under the influence of Prakriti, ultimately the Tamoguna, and under the congenial conditions, emergence of life happens from stone. So everything is occurring in a scientific progress, in a scientific process, right? According to the Karya Karana Bhava, and then we get the emergence of simplest life forms, one cell beings, and then multicellular creatures, and then here it's talking about the kai, mosses, and algae. That is the initial movement. So these entities also have a mind. They have atma, right? They have a mind and they also have the atma, but that mind is undeveloped mind. So that is why they don't get a clear reflection of jivatma from the original source of paramatma, right? So but those beings also have a mind, but the consciousness is not clearly reflected because the mind is not developed. Only when the mind gets more and more developed, then the consciousness starts getting reflected clearly. Like in human beings, we can see that consciousness is clearly reflected, but it's not so in the case of other beings where the mind is not fully developed, right? So we can actually go forward. They continue with the next paragraph.
So after this, plants with leaves and flowers came into being. In them, we find clear signs of life, and these definitely have a clearer reflection of consciousness than Kai. Then the lower animals, followed by the higher animals, evolved. At the end of the series, humans came into being. Thus, we find that the most primitive creation on earth was Kai, and the most advanced was the human being. There is reflection of consciousness in Kai, but it is so blurred that one is skeptical about its presence, while in the human being we find consciousness clearly reflected. Creation evolved gradually from the Kai group of plants to humans. Similarly, the reflection of consciousness gradually becomes clearer until it is complete in humans. The, the reflection of consciousness appears less in crude things, while in subtle things it is greater. In other words, the degree of subtlety or crudeness also indicates the degree of clarity of reflection of consciousness. The most primitive life on the earth, Kai, shows very little consciousness, and the most advanced form of creation, the human being, exhibits a very clear reflection of consciousness. This means that Kai is the crudest form of life on earth, and humans are the subtlest. They are more subtle than Kai. The process of creation in this phase is thus from crude to subtle. So in this paragraph, continues to talk about that transformation from crude to subtle, from Kai, which has, even though Kai has consciousness just as much as the humans, the reflection of consciousness in Kai, I think, is not well perceived, versus then, when you see the plants, then you can see a clear a reflection or clear demonstration of growth, that they evolve, they change, they two things, and it's looked at as a reflection of consciousness, and more so in animals, and much more so in humans, all in how we react to how we demonstrate that life forms. And as humans is considered as the most subtle in that evolution path, with the most reflection of the consciousness, and looked at as it reflects the one that reflects the most consciousness is looked at as the most subtle, and there is a relation or correlation between crude reflecting less consciousness, and subtle reflecting the most of consciousness. And so the human beings top of that evolution path, and getting closer and closer to the ability to go even subtler and merge with, be a part of Paramapurusha.
Yes, Maureen, nicely said. Yeah, thank you. That was the idea over here. So we keep saying, we keep talking about reflection of consciousness, right? So what do we actually mean by that? So even in the one-celled organisms, it also has a mind, it also has a atma, a jivatma, right? We know the mind has three parts, mahat tattvam, aham tattvam, and chitta, right? But however, the simplest or the most basic life forms, they have only active chitta. They do not have an active aham tattva, and certainly not mahat tattva. And because of the lack of development of the mind, there is not a clear reflection of consciousness, right? So even on the first, when we initially talked about this Karapatra, we talked about it, that if you have a puddle of water in the road, and if the water is very, very clean and clear, then you can get a good reflection of the full moon in that water, right? But if there is a lot of mud in the water or other things, there is a contamination of the water, then you may get a glimmering or a flickering of the light in the water, but you won't be able to see the image, right? So this is what they're actually talking about here. By the time you get to human beings, you have an active mahat tattva. In algae, you have an active chitta, but you don't have aham tattva and mahat tattva. The aham tattva and mahat tattva, they are in sushupta avastha. They're not active, right? They're actually dormant, right? So therefore the consciousness is not clearly reflected in them. So they do have life, and but when you look at them, you don't realize that they have life. They feel like as if they're like stone without life, right? So gradually, with the progress from plants up to animals, you begin to get aham tattva, which becomes active. And in the most developed apes, then you have the initial development of the preliminary, you get the initial development of the active mahat tattva, the awareness that one exists, right? In apes, you can see that the awareness that one exists is there. So this consciousness, this awareness is paralleled by the reflection of Paramatma in mind. So when we say reflection of consciousness, we mean the level of awareness in the different beings, right? So when we look at a human being, we know that the human being exists. They are very, very aware that they exist, right? But in the case of algae, in the case of underdeveloped beings, they do not have a clearly reflected consciousness because their mind is not developed. They only have active chitta. So for a full reflection of that, a clearly reflected jivatma, you need an active, developed mahat tattva. So this is what we're talking about with a clear reflection of consciousness, right? And so all of these are different living beings, but the level of consciousness getting reflected is different depending on how developed the mind is, right? Essentially, all of the essentially life has come from stone. We have all emerged from stone, and we are travelers on this path, on this great path, which started at 12 o'clock and came down to 6 o'clock. And at 6 o'clock, you get the creation of units, the potential for creation of unit beings. Unit being the individual stones. For the first time, you don't have you cannot have separation of the water, or you cannot have separation of the vayu, separation of jalam or other bhutas, akasha, right, agni. You can't have separation of that. So you can have separation only of, you can have units only of the Kshiti Tattva. That is why life emerges out of Kshiti Tattva. So there is no question of units until you come to the stone, Kshiti Tattva. So under congenial conditions, you get the emergence of simplest forms of life. So all of us actually came from those Moses and those algae. Right? We came from those from the stones. We became Moses and algae, and then through the sangarsha, through clash and cohesion. The clash and cohesion means struggling. To struggle to exist, the mind begins to develop. So if something is born as a plant, it is born as a plant, and then slowly there is a development, and the mind develops, and it goes to the next one. Same thing with, if you look at a monkey. So it's a monkey and a monkey. It is born as a monkey, and then suddenly the mind develops, and then it becomes a human being. So there's an evolution, right? So and when you get more developed mind, then on the strength of the developed mind, on that, then in the next birth, right, it gets a more sophisticated body, right? In this way you get the evolution, and this is what the Darwin observed, and it is correct, right? So modern science only talks about 6 o'clock to 10 o'clock, the movement from 6 o'clock to 10 o'clock. 10 o'clock is where the human beings are created. 6 o'clock is the stones. So going from 6 o'clock to 10 o'clock is the entire spectrum of modern science. So they do not know anything about after 10 o'clock. They do not know anything before 6 o'clock. So but from a yogic perspective, we know what happens from, we can understand that from 6 o'clock to 10 o'clock, whatever science is saying, yoga is also aligned with that. But science is not giving us the full picture. In yoga, we know what happens from 12 o'clock to 6 o'clock, from 6 o'clock again to 12 o'clock, what happens. So all of this is coming under the Karya Karana Bhava. Okay, nothing is without Karya Karana Bhava. So the Karana for everything is Parama Purusha. From Parama Purusha, all of this originated, and everything returns back to Parama Purusha. Okay, so we can actually go to the next paragraph.
But in this, you are connecting that more active, Aham Tattva, and the more active Mahat Tattva is what reflects, consciousness.
Yeah.
But the more active, Mahat Tattva would be really less kind of active, right? I mean, in terms of what we think of it as action, because more of the action comes from not from sattvic, but more from rajasic and tamasic gunas, right?
Yeah. Action comes from rajasic. That is correct. But the level of awareness, the awareness that I exist.
Awareness, right?
Okay. The awareness that I exist, that comes only when you have a well-developed mind, right? I exist. The feeling that I exist. That feeling will not be there in algae, because they don't have that developed mind. They have only the chitta. So the chitta is pre-programmed to function according to the Prakriti's design. Right? So they just do what they're supposed to do. They don't do anything beyond that, right? And even if you look at the animals, they're also pre-programmed, right? They have a chitta, and some of the animals may have even Aham Tattva, and they're pre-programmed, and they just do what they're supposed to do. Ahara, Nidra, Bhaya, Maitram. They don't do anything beyond that. Then when we come to human beings, we have a completely developed mind. We have, Mahat Tattva is completely developed, Aham Tattva is developed, Chitta is also developed. So then, because of the Mahat Tattva being completely developed, that is why we have this vikalpa, the choice whether I want to live this human life or I want to live the animal life. That choice is available to us only because of the developed Mahat Tattva. That kind of a choice is not available to other beings. And other beings, they don't even have an awareness that they exist, right? If the
right.
mind is not developed, they don't even have that awareness.
So there we perceive a greater reflection of consciousness, but it's more a perception than, is that what you're saying?
No. See, everything is ultimately the samagri for this whole universe is Paramapurusha.
Paramapurusha, right.
Paramapurusha is the samagri. Even though the samagri, even stone, like for instance stone, that stone is also made of Purusha.
Right.
But we don't consider a stone as living. Do we consider a stone as living? Does it have the awareness that it exists? A stone? A stone doesn't have a reflecting plate to reflect the consciousness. It doesn't have that awareness that I exist. Stone doesn't have the awareness I exist. I exist. So the initial beings that developed from the stone, they don't have the awareness that they exist. Right? They don't have that awareness that they exist, because that is why, because the mental plate is not fully developed. Therefore the consciousness is not fully reflected, and therefore they don't have that awareness. So when we say consciousness is not fully reflected, what do we mean by that? We mean that the mind is not fully developed. Mind is not fully developed to reflect Paramapurusha. Right? Our mind is fully developed. That's why we can reflect Paramapurusha if we make the mental plate clean. It's a different thing that our mental plate is having lot of malas and doshas. As a result of that, our mental plate is muddied, as a result of which Paramapurusha is not getting reflected. But if our mental plate were to become clean, right, if it becomes Shuddha, then Paramapurusha will be clearly reflected on that mental plate. So like for instance, if you have a mirror in front of you and you look at yourself, right, the mirror is very clean and you can look at yourself, your complete image is visible. But on the other hand, if the mirror is dirty, right, then you cannot look at yourself, right? So the same way, Paramapurusha's reflection, if that mental plate, which is the mirror, is not clean, it is not reflected, but it is having the capacity to reflect. But on the other hand, if that mental plate is not strong enough to reflect Paramapurusha, it doesn't have the capacity to reflect the Paramapurusha, then also reflection doesn't happen, which is the case in the case of Kai and all the initial mosses and algae. That is what it is. They have a chitta, right? They have a chitta, but they do not have a aham tattva and mahat tattva. As a result, they don't have that awareness. Is that clear, or is it still confusing?
Yeah, no, that's clear.
Yeah.
Then since we continue reading, it was said earlier that the supreme state of consciousness is subtle. The process of creation in this phase from crude to subtle means that creation is advancing towards non-qualified consciousness. Creation is manifested in crude form out of the subtle consciousness under the qualifying influence of Prakriti, and it is again advancing from crude towards subtle under the qualifying pressure of Prakriti. Consciousness takes a crude form first and later again advances from that crude form to non-qualified consciousness, which is subtle. Thus, the entire creation has two phases. The first phase is the process of the transformation of subtle into crude, and then the second is that of crude into subtle. So in this paragraph, this again captures what you've been talking about, this transformation of from 12 o'clock to 6 o'clock, which goes from subtle to crude, and then from 6 o'clock back to 12 o'clock, which goes from crude back to subtle. And that's that cycle, that this all under the influence of Prakriti, both from crude to subtle, as well as again from subtle to back to crude, or crude from subtle to crude, and then from crude back to subtle, is all under the influence of Prakriti. Or in one place they use the word influence, in the other place they use the word pressure, but it's really the same.
Same thing.
Prakriti's,
Cause. Pressure is tamoguna influence of tamoguna. Yeah. So we have actually two phases in the process of creation, right? One is the sanchar dhara, which is the movement from the subtle to the crude, from 12 o'clock to 6 o'clock. And then the other one is the prati sanchar dhara, movement from 6 o'clock to 12 o'clock, that is from the crude to subtle, right? So the sanchar dhara is from 12 o'clock to 6 o'clock, that is the crudification or the goodification right? That gunification happens, and right, and from 12 o'clock to 6 o'clock the crudification happens, or the gunification happens. From back from 6 o'clock to 12 o'clock the subtlification happens. Things become more and more subtle, because we are going towards the more subtle realm, right? And so from 6 o'clock sometimes we have the visport, the jadaspota happens, or sometimes life emerges. We talked about that. So so it's not like when the jadaspota happens we go from 6 o'clock to 3 o'clock. That is the maximum we can go. Otherwise we have the creation of life, right, which are two complete separate pathways, right? So when life is getting created, then subtlification happens, right? So then as when the at 6 o'clock, when the kendra nuga shakti becomes dominant, then life emerges, and when there is a congenial conditions for life to emerge, life emerges, right? So that is a separate pathway. And if life doesn't emerge, then jadaspota happens, and that is a separate pathway. So when life emerges at that point in time, the sattva guna gets predominant. Sattva guna is more subtler compared to the other gunas. So when sattva guna gets predominant, that means we are going to the process of from crude to subtle. We are going towards subtle. That's why we are saying subtlification, right? So that is what this paragraph is actually talking about, the two processes, right? The sanchardhara and pratisanchardhara.
Right.
Okay. So yeah.
So continuing, creation, we've seen, is the thought projection of the qualified supreme entity, Saguna Brahma. Purusha, in the Saguna Brahma stage, takes all these forms under the influence of Prakriti as thought waves of Saguna Brahma and becomes crudest in the form of Sitis Tattva. In the next phase, when creation moves from crude to subtle, it is in fact the thought waves of Saguna Brahma which move towards subtlety. Humans are created last of all. In them, we find fully reflected consciousness. This leads to the conclusion that humans are the final expression in the thought wave of Saguna Brahma, and that beyond this stage is the merger of the unit consciousness with the cosmic consciousness. Cosmic consciousness is abstract or subtle, but under the qualifying influence of Prakriti, it starts manifesting itself as the creation, first from subtle to crude, then again from the crude forms back to the subtle or abstract. The crudest stage is the creation of Chitit Tattva, where consciousness exists as an inanimate object. Thus, in the process of creation, the more consciousness moves towards crudeness, the smaller is the reflection of cosmic consciousness. And when it moves from crude to subtle, the reflection of consciousness is correspondingly greater. As consciousness is fully reflected in humans, this shows that on its return journey from crude to subtle, consciousness has made humans its final abode, from whence it can emerge in cosmic consciousness. The creation is only a thought wave of Saguna Brahma. The final stage of creation, the human being, is then naturally the ultimate stage of the thought wave. Thus, humans are the highest evolved beings and are the ultimate stage in the evolution of life. So this again talks about this cycle from Nirguna Brahma. It becomes Saguna Brahma and goes through this manifestation under the influence of Prakriti, and then from the subtle Nirguna Brahma, when it under the influence of Prakriti as it becomes Saguna Brahma. That entity goes to the crudest form, which is Tattva, uh, and then it uh, it goes back from the crudest form to the subtlest form, which back as the highest form in there is the human uh, beings, where the consciousness is, is reflected the most, and then that consciousness merges into cosmic consciousness, is the merger of the unit consciousness and the global or the cosmic consciousness into the unit consciousness merges into cosmic consciousness, is through a human being as the last or the final stage of the whole process is a thought wave of Saguna Brahma, and the thought wave transforms from subtle to the crudest, and crudest, the thought wave again transforms back to the subtle, and the thought waves are the most subtle in the human beings, and subtler than that would be to merge into the cosmic consciousness. And so it brings in Saguna Brahma and the thought waves of Saguna Brahma, which is all that you see, all that we perceive is the reflection of the thought waves of that Saguna Brahma, and is what's captured and summarized in this. And it concludes with that the humans are the highest evolved beings, and the last stage before it it merges back into the universal consciousness, and the cycle continues.
Yes, Maurya, nicely said. Yeah, that is the idea. So a new element is being brought over here is the status of the human beings in the Shristi chakra, right? So the human beings are the most evolved beings in this universe, right? And the reason for that is qualitative and not quantitative. The thing that we talked from the beginning, right? What do you mean by qualitative difference is that human beings are not animals, right? Human beings are not animals. They're not just intelligent animals. Human beings are different from animals, not quantitatively but qualitatively. We are the most intelligent. It's not that we are the most intelligent in the animal kingdom. If that were the case, then the animals we could qualify as plants who are able to, then we can call animals as plants who are able to move, right? We can call animals as moving plants, right? And intelligent animals as humans. That is not the case. It is not just merely quantitative difference, but a qualitative difference between animals and plants. So human beings are qualitatively different. What we mean is that we have something unique which is not there in other beings. We have this this desire for the infinite which is not there in other beings. Therefore we cannot call human beings as an intelligent animal. It's not just a degree of ability to move or a degree of intelligence, right? So uh, that is why we have a different species, a different classification of existence, right? Human beings are not just the most intelligent of the spectrum of animals, but there is a qualitative difference, and that is that humans have an infinite desire. That infinite desire is not there in plants and animals, right? So even though there is a jaivi dharma in all the beings, every living being has a jaivi dharma. That is the dharma of every living creature, right? But human beings also have a jaivi dharma. But how are we different from other species is because we have this desire for the infinite, which we've been talking about from the beginning, right? So all the beings, we have to take some kind of food. All of us have to, we need fuel, we need to take some kind of food. right? Everything has a process of respiration that goes on, and every being has a unique process, right? So there are certain things which are unique to the plants which are not there in animals. There are certain things which are unique to the animals which are not there in other beings. But the only living being which has this infinite desire, right? The infinite desire is to essentially move from 10 o'clock to 12 o'clock and achieving union with that Shuddha Purusha. That desire is there only in human beings. That desire for knowing the infinite is unique to all human beings. Uh, right? Everybody has it, but many or most of the human beings do not realize that they have this infinite desire, right? So not only that, but if you compare the human beings from 1,000 years ago to human beings of today, human beings today are more developed. So what we are going to get in different places of the universe, there are human beings, but this is not the place. This universe, I mean, essentially, Earth is not the only place where our human beings are there. There could be other planets where there are human beings, right? So like how 1,000 years ago the kind of human beings we were, now we, after 1,000 years, we are more developed today compared to what we were before. Even then we had that infinite desire. We always had that infinite desire. The human beings may be present on different planets in different parts of the universe, maybe in different phases of development, but being a human being means it's to have an infinite desire, and that is the qualitative difference, and that is what allows them to ultimately stand up and move and follow the path of manava dharma, to ultimately move from 10 o'clock to 12 o'clock and attain that union with that purusha from whom they emerged, right? Human beings emerged from parama purusha. They get that union with the parama purusha, and that is possible only at the human being state when they emerge at 10 o'clock, not possible for other beings, right? So that is because we have this fully developed mind. As we have this fully developed mind, we have this awareness, we have full awareness, we have parama purusha's reflection is completely reflected on a mental plate, and if our mental plate is clean, right, if it's suddham, then agragati is quick. So that is what we're trying to do in sadhana, is trying to make the mental plate clean, may make the mental plate subtle, so that we can move from 10 o'clock to 12 o'clock and attain that union with parama purusha. Okay, so the next paragraph is a long one, so can we conclude the session over here, Mohdaya, unless there are any questions?
Sure.
Okay, Mohdaya, अस्तु तर्हि धन्यवादः, नमस्कारः.